Kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and silence. I'd been gone 4 days, a work trip to Austin, quarterly review for the firm, the kind of trip I'd taken a dozen times before without thinking twice. My flight landed 2 hours early because of a tailwind, and I figured I'd surprise my husband. Maybe pick up Thai food on the way home. Maybe actually sit together at the table for once instead of eating separately at our laptops. I pulled into the driveway at 9:47 p.m. The lights upstairs were on. I remember thinking that was odd because my husband never went upstairs before 11. He was a night owl, stayed down in his office until midnight, sometimes later. He'd always been that way. Even on our honeymoon, I fell asleep alone and woke up to find him at the hotel desk working. I came in through the garage, set my suitcase down quietly. Not because I was suspicious, just because the house felt still in a way that made me not want to break it. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, stood there for a moment looking at the mail I'd left on the counter before I left. Then I heard it. Footsteps upstairs. 2 sets. I want to be clear about something. In the 5 years I'd been married to my husband, I never once went through his phone. Never checked his location, never asked him to account for his evenings when I traveled. I trusted him the way you trust gravity, automatically, without thinking about it. That trust died somewhere between the kitchen and the bottom of the stairs. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, long enough for my brain to run through every reasonable explanation. His brother was in town. No, I would have known. He was on a work call in the guest room. 2 sets of footsteps, not one. The TV was on upstairs. I couldn't hear any voices except the soft, low ones that people use when they think no one is listening. I went upstairs. Our bedroom door was closed. There was a sliver of light underneath it. I didn't open it. I don't know why. Later, people would tell me I should have thrown that door open, confronted them right there, made them face it. Maybe they're right, but standing in that hallway, something in me already knew what was on the other side, and I wasn't ready to let it be real yet. I stood there for another full minute. Then I did something I still can't fully explain. I took my phone out of my pocket. I opened the camera, and I pressed record. Not through the door. I'm not even sure what I was thinking. I pointed it at the floor, at the light coming from under the door, at the hallway itself. My hands were not shaking. That's the part I remember most clearly. My hands were completely still. Then the door opened. She was the one who opened it. She walked out first, still adjusting the strap of her dress, and she looked up and saw me standing there in the hallway and went completely white. Her name was Petra. She had been my best friend for 11 years. My husband came out behind her. He was in his undershirt. He had the particular expression of someone who has been rehearsing an explanation and has now forgotten every word of it. Neither of them spoke. I looked at Petra for a long time. She was the person I called when my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. She was the person who helped me write my vows. She sat in the front row at my wedding and cried happy tears, and I remember thinking, this is what it means to have someone in your corner. I said, "How long?" Petra looked at my husband. My husband looked at the wall. I said it again. "How long?" He said 8 months. She said, "Don't do this here." I said, "Here is the only place we're doing this." Then I turned around and walked back down the stairs. I sat in the kitchen for 3 hours. My husband came down twice and I told him both times to go away. Petra left without saying another word. I heard her car pull out of the driveway around midnight. I did not cry. I don't say that because I'm proud of it. I say it because I think my body understood, even then, that this was just the beginning and it was conserving something. Here's what I did over the next 30 days, and I want to be specific about this because I think it matters. I did not confront him again. I did not throw his things out. I did not tell anyone what I knew. Instead, I made an appointment with a family law attorney. I found one through a referral from a colleague, a woman who had been through her own divorce 2 years earlier and came out the other side with her retirement account intact. The attorney's name was Catherine, and she had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had seen every version of this story 100 times. Catherine told me the same thing in 3 different ways. Documentation is everything. She told me to get access to the joint account statements for the last 2 years. She told me to make note of any assets I could identify. She told me not to move money, not yet, but to know where everything was. I spent 4 weekends doing exactly that. What I found was worse than the infidelity. Over 14 months, my husband had moved roughly $34,000 out of our joint savings into an account I had never seen before. Small amounts at first. 200 here, 350 there, then larger ones. The transfers corresponded almost exactly with when Petra had been going through a hard time and needed help. He had been funding her. Renovating her apartment, I would later find out. Paying for a trip to Portugal they took together while I was at a conference in Chicago. I printed everything. I organized it by date in a manila folder and brought it back to Catherine, and she looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "Do you know who your husband uses for his firm's outside counsel?" I said I wasn't sure. Mostly, he handled that himself. She pulled up something on her computer, turned the screen toward me. The name on the screen was one I recognized immediately. It was the name of someone who had been in our lives for 3 years. Someone who had attended our 4th of July party 2 summers in a row. Someone who had sat across from me at a dinner table and asked about my job and complimented my cooking and shaken my husband's hand like they were old friends. His name was Patrick. He was the senior partner at the firm my husband used for quarterly legal review, and he was about to become the opposing counsel in our divorce. Catherine noticed my expression. She said, "Do you know him?" I said, "He's been in my home." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very carefully, "That doesn't necessarily change anything. He's representing the firm, not your husband personally. But it does mean he knows your husband well, and that's worth being aware of." I drove home that night and sat in the driveway for a long time. The thing about discovering a betrayal is that it doesn't happen once. It keeps happening. Every new piece of information is its own separate loss. First it was my husband and my best friend. Then it was the money. Now it was this. The feeling that the world I thought I was living in had different dimensions than the one that actually existed, and I had been walking around in the wrong one without knowing it. I went inside. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. And then I called my sister. My sister is 4 years older than me, and she is the least sentimental person I know in the best possible way. She doesn't tell you what you want to hear. She tells you what she would do, and then she waits. I told her everything. All of it. The night I came home. The 30 days of documentation. The money. Patrick. When I finished, she was quiet for a second. Then she said, "So the lawyer your husband uses for work is someone who has socialized with both of you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And Catherine knows this?" I said, "You Tez." My sister said, "Okay, then trust Catherine knows. This she does." My sister said, "Okay, then trust Catherine. And don't you dare settle." That was all she said. It was exactly enough. The divorce filing happened on a Tuesday in March. My husband's initial response was to call me. 3 times in 1 hour, I let all 3 go to voicemail. The messages started confused, then became upset, then became something that sounded almost like grief, which I found interesting given that he had not seemed particularly grieved over the past 14 months. His attorney called Catherine's office by end of business that day. It was not Patrick. That surprised me. Catherine explained later that Patrick had recused himself from the matter. She didn't have details beyond that, just that there had been a conflict identified and Patrick had stepped back and referred my husband's personal case to another attorney at a different firm. I remember feeling something when she told me that. Not quite relief, more like the ground shifting slightly underfoot. I said, "Did Patrick say why?" Catherine said she didn't know. She said these things happen sometimes. I thought about it for the rest of the day and couldn't put it out of my head. Patrick had been in our house. He knew my husband. He was precisely the kind of person who would, in most circumstances, close ranks. That's what people do. They protect who they know. He hadn't. The discovery phase of the divorce took 9 weeks. During that time, my husband's legal team made 3 attempts to characterize the joint account withdrawals as legitimate household expenses. Catherine dismantled each argument with the kind of methodical patience that I had started to deeply admire. She had a way of letting opposing counsel finish speaking and then simply placing a document on the table, as if the document was the only response necessary. By week 7, my husband's new attorney had stopped making the household expenses argument. I was in Catherine's office on a Wednesday afternoon when she took a call she said she needed to handle privately. She stepped out. I sat there and looked at the city through her window for 10 minutes. When she came back in, she had a particular expression on her face, controlled but not entirely. She sat down. She said, "I want to tell you something, and I want to be clear that this came to me through a completely proper channel, so I'm not going to have any concerns about sharing it." I said, "Okay." She said, "Patrick reached out to my office. He wanted me to know that he had been aware, through the course of his professional relationship with your husband's firm, of certain information regarding the financial transfers. He had not been retained by your husband personally, and therefore had no obligation of confidentiality to him. He said, and this is what he wanted conveyed, that he was not willing to be aware of something that he believed constituted harm to someone he had sat across a dinner table from." I stared at her. She said, "He's offered to provide a voluntary statement to confirm the timeline of the transfers and their stated purpose, as described to him by your husband. It would corroborate your documentation independently." I said, "Why would he do that?" Catherine folded her hands on the desk. She said, "He told me, and again, this is what he wanted me to convey, that your husband had described the transfers to him as investments in a business venture. Patrick said he'd asked once whether you were aware of them. Your husband told him you handled the finances together and you both knew. Patrick said he didn't push it at the time. He said he wishes he had. And he said that now that he understood the full picture, he wasn't willing to let that conversation just sit there." The room was very quiet. I thought about the 4th of July party. Patrick standing by the fire pit with a beer, asking me how the new job was going. My husband beside me with his hand on the small of my back. I thought about how many conversations I'd been left out of, how many rooms I hadn't been in. Then I thought about the fact that this man, who had every reason to say nothing, who had professional distance to hide behind, who owed me absolutely nothing, had decided to tell the truth anyway. I pressed my lips together for a second. Then I said, "Tell him thank you." The settlement conference was on a Friday morning in April. By that point, my husband knew about Patrick's statement. His attorney had clearly communicated the weight of it, because when we walked into that room, my husband did not look like a man with options. He looked like someone who had spent 14 months building something and watched it come down in a single morning. I did not feel sorry for him. I want to be honest about that. I had done the work of grief already, mostly alone at my kitchen table over the previous 3 months, and I had arrived at this room on the other side of it. Catherine had told me what to expect. She had prepared me for every scenario. She had told me not to speak unless necessary, to let her handle the room, to stay neutral in my expression regardless of what was said. I did all of that. By noon, we had an agreement. I kept the house. I received half of all joint assets, including the retirement accounts, which had not been touched. The $34,000 in documented transfers was factored into the settlement as marital funds improperly diverted, which meant I was compensated for every dollar. My husband's attorney shook Catherine's hand. My husband did not look at me. I walked out into the April sunlight and stood on the sidewalk for a minute. My sister called. She'd been waiting by her phone. I said, "It's done." She exhaled. Then she said, "Do you want to come over? I'll make that lemon pasta you like." I said yes. I said I'd be there in an hour. I went back inside for a moment to collect my things. In the elevator, I thought about the version of myself who had stood in that hallway 3 months ago with her hands completely still and her phone out, not fully knowing why. She had known something. Some part of her, in that moment, had decided to act rather than collapse, had decided to remember rather than react. I thought, good for her. I sold the house 6 weeks later. Not because I couldn't afford to keep it. The settlement covered the buyout easily, but because I drove home one evening and pulled into the driveway and sat there for 10 minutes and realized I didn't feel anything when I looked at it. Not grief, not attachment, not even nostalgia. It was just a building. The realtor listed it on a Thursday. I had an offer by Sunday. I found a condo 20 minutes away, on the 3rd floor, with windows that face east. I get the morning light every day. I drink my coffee standing at the window and I watch the neighborhood wake up, and I think about how strange it is, how a life can look completely different from the outside than it does from the inside. My best friend of 11 years has not contacted me. I did not expect her to. There are versions of the story, I know, where the two women eventually talk, where there is some kind of accounting, some kind of conversation that closes the loop. I don't think that's my version. I think some things just stay open. Patrick sent a brief note through Catherine's office after the settlement. No explanation beyond what he'd already communicated. Just a few lines. He wrote that he hoped I was doing well, and that he was sorry he hadn't asked better questions sooner. I've read it a few times. I don't know exactly what I feel about it. Gratitude, yes, but also something more complicated. Something about the fact that honesty, when it comes from an unexpected place, lands differently than you expect it to. It doesn't feel like rescue. It feels like being reminded that the world is not entirely made of people who look the other way. That matters. More than I can easily explain. My sister asked me once, a few months after everything settled, whether I was angry. I thought about it for a real minute before I answered. I said, I was. For a while, I was so angry that it was the first thing I felt when I woke up every morning. Angry at him, at Petra, at myself for not seeing it sooner. At the whole 4 years, I didn't look at the bank statements closely enough. She said, and now? I said, now I'm mostly just tired of giving it real estate in my head. She laughed a little. She said that was probably the healthiest thing I'd said in 6 months. I think she was right. I'm not someone who believes that betrayal makes you stronger. I think that's a tidy thing to say about a messy experience, and I've never trusted tidy things. What I believe is that you find out what you're made of in the moments after the door opens and you're standing in a hallway you didn't expect to be standing in, with information you weren't prepared to have. I found out that I was made of the kind of thing that doesn't shake. That's enough. For now, that's enough. The east-facing windows help. I've thought a lot about what actually causes a marriage to end, not the moment you find out. That's just the moment you stop being the last person to know. The ending had already happened long before I walked into that hallway, long before Petra adjusted the strap of her dress and looked up and saw me standing there. It had been happening in small, quiet increments, in every decision my husband made that he didn't tell me about. The transfers, the trip to Portugal, the story he told Patrick about how we handled our finances together, as a team, both of us aware. He had been constructing a version of our life that looked exactly like ours from the outside and had almost nothing to do with me on the inside. That's what I keep coming back to, not the betrayal itself, but the architecture of it. How deliberate it was, how much effort it takes to deceive someone that thoroughly, and how that effort doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a choice, made repeatedly, over 14 months, to prioritize your own comfort over another person's reality. My husband made that choice every time he logged into the account and moved money. Petra made it every time she accepted what he sent. And those choices had weight. They had consequences. Not because the universe keeps score in any mystical sense, but because actions that are built on lies require more and more lies to hold them up, and eventually the structure becomes too heavy to stand. Catherine didn't rescue me. Patrick didn't rescue me. My sister didn't rescue me, though Lord knows she tried. What actually turned the tide was 30 days of quiet, methodical work. Me, alone at my kitchen table, doing the unglamorous thing of pulling bank statements and printing documents and organizing them by date in a manila folder. That folder was the thing. Everything else followed from it. I think about that a lot when I feel the urge to react, to throw the door open, to confront, to make it loud and visible and immediate. There's a version of that night where I do all of those things, where I shout at them both in the hallway and it feels like justice for about 45 seconds, and then becomes something they can use against me. Instead, I stood there with still hands and recorded the light coming from under the door. That wasn't courage, it was instinct, but it turned out to be the most important thing I did. Wisdom, I think, is just that. Learning to tell the difference between the reaction that feels satisfying and the action that actually helps you. It's not a lesson anyone teaches you cleanly. You learn it the hard way, usually, in a hallway you didn't expect to be standing in. And integrity. Patrick choosing to tell the truth when silence would have been so much easier, when he had every professional and personal reason to simply not know anything. That is what integrity looks like in practice. Not a grand gesture. not a public declaration. Just a phone call to an attorney he didn't have to make, because he decided that sitting on what he knew was a form of participation he wasn't willing to have. I think about the east-facing windows. I think about the lemon pasta my sister made. I think about how the things that held me together were so ordinary. That's where resilience actually lives, not in the dramatic moments, but in the decision to keep going after them, to make the appointment, to print the folder, to answer the phone when your sister calls. That's enough. That's everything, actually.